They weaponize the crowd. In January 1932, Western El Salvador rises, and the state answers by turning the town square into a trap. The massacre is only the first chapter. The real mystery is what comes after. Why survivors stop speaking their language out loud, and a whole country learns to whisper, silencing the voices that once defined them. I'm Arturo, and this is Latin Lore, from Latin America's history to mysteries and true crime, to local legends, whispering Latin intrigue. Every tale is verified in archives before it reaches your headphones. Hit subscribe, fresh revelations drop every week, ready for your next campfire debate. The plaza looks like a bull ring when you watch it through the eyes of 1932. Not because there's a fiesta, because there's a gate, because there's a crowd, because the state wants the crowd to do part of the work. A crackdown becomes a massacre, and then the country learns to whisper. This event's brutality left scars that echo through generations, shaping indigenous communities' resilience and silence. Picture Izalco in the last days of January, heat pressed flat over the town like a palm on the back of your neck. Soldiers, boots, eyes that don't blink, a rope hung where everyone could see it. The records don't agree on one detail. Some accounts say a ceiba, others insist on an olive tree near the park between the church and the municipal buildings. But nobody disputes the point of the scene. The state wanted the death to be public, unforgettable, instructive. Wait, notice the cruelty isn't only in killing, it's in staging. There's a detail that keeps returning like a knot you can't untie, a necktie. Some testimonies say they forced Feliciano Ama to wear one before the hanging, like a joke, like a costume, like a way of saying, we can dress you in our world and still destroy you. His story exemplifies resistance and the brutal repression he faced. Now rewind, because ropes don't appear without hands. Western El Salvador in the early 1930s was a green slope of coffee plants and hunger. Coffee had become the nation's pulse, and the families who own the pulse believe they own the body. When the Great Depression hits, it doesn't arrive like a headline. It comes like empty pots and silent workdays. The land keeps receipts, and the receipts are cruel. Export wealth on one side, thin soup on the other. Before 1932, there was already paper violence, laws that sounded liberal and modern but tasted like theft. Communal lands, the old backbone of many indigenous communities, were broken into private property. On paper, it looked like progress. On the ground, it felt like a blade. Losing these lands wasn't just economic, it was a cultural wound, severing communities from their roots and identity. And once land is taken, labor becomes the only bargaining chip left, and the bargain is rigged. The old colonial arrangements, in which workers might receive small plots to grow subsistence crops in exchange for labor, eroded over the decades. Wage labor replaced it, and in a coffee kingdom, wage labor is a leash. You could be free in theory, yet trapped in practice. Your choices shrink to a single question: work or starve. Then the market collapses, coffee prices fall hard, and the countryside feels it first, like a punch in the gut before the face even knows. Wages drop, jobs vanish, debts remain. Hunger turns political speeches into background noise. The people in the hills and the fincas don't need ideology to understand what's happening. They can read it in the bones of the weak. When the economy breaks, the poor are asked to pay for the repair with their bodies, and the legacy is silence, disappearance, and ongoing trauma. In the cities, politics tries to keep a straight face. Arturo Araujo comes with reformist language and ideas about a vital minimum and dignity that sound like medicine. But the state's finances are tied to coffee exports, and coffee exports are collapsing. Promises become smoke. Meanwhile, the military hears a different kind of truth. The government can't pay its soldiers, and an unpaid army is a storm looking for a direction. On December 2nd, 1931, the coup came quickly. Araujo was out. Maximiliano Hernandez Martinez rises out of the uniform like a blade sliding out of a sleeve. He presents himself as order, as destiny, as the man who can hold the country together with one fist. Some say he believed in mystic signs, in divine help, but his most practical talent was simpler: identifying threats, canceling the future, and calling it salvation. Here's the part that feels like a street magic trick. At first, Martinez lets people believe elections will happen, municipal elections, a legal channel, a controlled outlet for anger. Organizers come into the open. Meetings bloom. Leaflets circulate. Then the promise shrinks. Winners are blocked, or results are undermined. The door that looked open is slammed shut. Wait, notice what that does to a society. It teaches you that even peaceful roots can be traps. And once the legal door is shut, pressure has only one place to go. Agustin Farabundo Martí and the Communist Party became the name the regime can use as a warning label. International, subversive, a threat that makes elites clutch their coffee fortunes and makes violence sound like defense. But hold that thought. Labels are proper precisely because they simplify. They flatten local intelligence. They turn complicated hunger into one convenient enemy. Because in the West, the grievances have older roots than party pamphlets. The struggle is triangulated by land, hunger, and dignity. It's also shaped by race, by a daily humiliation that says, indigenous people are always suspect, always backward, always expendable. The echoes of 1932 still resonate today, reminding us that the fight for justice and recognition continues in El Salvador's communities. In the late hours of January 22nd, 1932, the movement spreads like fire across dry grass. Thousands of campesinos and indigenous people rise, armed mostly with rocks, sticks, and corbos, machetes meant for work, turned into last arguments. Juayua, Nahuizalco, Izalco Tacuba, towns with deep indigenous histories fall into rebel control, if only briefly. A garrison here, a local authority there, a jolt of power, like someone finally pushing back against the table that's been pinning them down. Wait, notice the rebellion isn't one clean machine. In some places, violence targets symbols of abuse, certain officials, certain exploiters, and specific local figures who embody the daily grind of humiliation. In other areas, it turns chaotic because chaos is what happens when decades of injustice are shaken loose in a single night. But the rebels share a reality. They are humbly armed and face a state whose power has been modernizing, with better communication, transport weaponry, and a rural security apparatus built to protect coffee. The government reacts fast, and it doesn't respond gently. Security forces, especially the National Guard and other armed units, move with rifles and trucks. Alongside them appear the Civic Guard and civilian patrols organized by local elites. These men know the footpaths, the families, the grudges. This is where the story turns black. They weaponize the crowd. They turn neighbor against neighbor, suspicion into policy, gossip into a death sentence. In that system, the state doesn't need to recognize your face. It only needs someone to name you. You can feel the shift in the air when repression stops being arrest and becomes extermination. Summary courts appear like theater props, questions asked quickly, verdicts delivered faster, sometimes no judgment at all. The point isn't justice. The fact is speed. People are forced to dig holes. Others are lined up and shot in fields and plazas at the edge of ravines. Many are killed without any confirmation of participation, because the new rule is simple. Suspicion equals guilt. And then comes the second rule, even uglier. Identity equals suspicion. Wearing indigenous clothing, speaking Nahuatl, having indigenous features, living in the wrong town, it becomes enough. Children and elders are not spared by a machine like that, because a machine like that isn't hunting actions, it's hunting categories. Wait, notice how terror changes its target. It stops caring about what you did and starts caring about who you are. That's how a massacre becomes a race-making event. In remote communities, far from cameras and far from paperwork, killing takes other forms. Accounts speak of bayonets and machetes used to finish what gunfire started, especially where bullets were scarce or where the message needed to be intimate. No need for gore to understand what that means. The state's allies wanted survivors to carry a memory that would warn their children. Colonial terror isn't just death. It's death designed to travel, to echo, to become a story people whisper. Fire joins the campaign. Villages are burned as collective punishment. Wayua, Nahuizalco, Tacuba, and Apaneca appear again and again in memory as places where smoke became a warning. Burning a house isn't only destroying wood, it's deleting food stores, clothing, tools, and seeds. It's attacking a future. It's telling a community, we can erase your tomorrow. And smoke has a special power. It can be seen from far away. It becomes a billboard for fear. Wait, notice how thorough a terror campaign tries to be. Hospitals are checked. The wounded are dragged out. The sick don't receive mercy because mercy would soften the lesson. Bodies pile up to the point where burial can't keep pace. Roadsides and ditches become the first graves. A witness later observed that vultures ate well that year, an ugly line, but an honest one. It's what happens when a state turns human life into debris and then pretends it's cleaning up. And when the dead are too many, the landscape becomes a hiding place. Mass graves without markers. bodies thrown into ravines. Rivers used to carry away evidence, grief, and names. The Lempa is often invoked as a waterway that swallowed secrets. Whether everybody went to the same place isn't the point. The point is the pattern, disappearance as policy. Because if there's no body, there's no funeral. If there's no funeral, there's no public mourning. And if there's no public mourning, the silence trains itself. Everyone asks for the number 10,000, 20,000, 30,000. Some accounts reach higher. But hold this carefully, the uncertainty is not just a historian's headache. It's part of the crime. Terror fractures records, destroys testimony, forces survivors to stay quiet, and turns counting into danger. Many summaries repeat a toll of around 30,000 killed in the weeks that followed. Other estimates land lower. The truth is a range, and the range is evidence of how completely the state broke the mirror. Now step closer to one face inside the storm. Feliciano Ama, a Nahua Pipil man from Izalco, a day laborer, a community leader shaped by the cofradía system, those brotherhoods that were Catholic on the surface and communal in their bones. Cofradías weren't just religious clubs. They were networks of care, mutual aid, and authority, places where leadership was tested in responsibilities and rituals, where community memory was carried like an ember from one generation to the next. Wait, notice how power reads those spaces. A cofradía is hard to control because it doesn't need the state's permission to exist. It survives by adapting, by mixing saints with older cosmologies, by building loyalty that isn't owed to plantation bosses. That loyalty looks like trouble to local elites. It seems like a rival government, even when it's just people trying to keep each other alive. That's why cofradías are both spiritual and political, because survival is political when the world wants you erased. Ama's story is woven into the fabric of land loss and humiliation. Like many others, he lived the reality of dispossession, communal lands chipped away by expropriation, backed by influence and force. He becomes a figure of resistance not because he wanted a title, but because his community needed someone who could speak, organize, and insist. In a coffee zone, insisting is dangerous. Being visible is dangerous. And Ama was visible. That visibility, in a settler colonial logic, is a threat that must be broken publicly. When the uprising erupts, Ama and indigenous communities in Los Izalcos move with their own goals. There are ties, tenuous, uneven, to communist organizers, but don't make the mistake of imagining a clean chain of command. In many indigenous zones, outside organizers were mistrusted, especially Ladinos bringing big new ideas. Yet hunger and dispossession create strange alliances. A revolt offered a last chance, not only to demand better conditions, but to reclaim land, dignity, and a voice in a nation that treated them as labor, not as people. After violence in Sonsonate, Ama goes into hiding in the hills, and here the story becomes a hunt. Military and security forces, supported by local networks, look for the person they can turn into a symbol. It's not enough to defeat rebels in the field. Symbols must be crushed, because symbols teach others how to stand. Wait, notice the logic. A leader isn't just a leader, he's a doorway. If you slam that doorway in public, others learn not to walk through. When they catch him, they don't simply execute him quietly. They perform his death. January 28th, 1932, Ama is hanged in the center of Izalco on that disputed tree that memory cannot agree upon, because trauma remembers sensation more than botany. Some accounts say his body was left hanging for days as a warning. Whether it was hours or days, the purpose is the same, to make the plaza a classroom. And the necktie detail, if true, tightens the humiliation into a message. Now look at the contrast the regime manufactures. Farabundo Martí, the communist leader, receives a brief tribunal and is executed by firing squad on February 1st, 1932. Procedure, even minimal, helps the state craft a political story. We tried him. But Ama's route to death is more brutal, more public, less interested in legality. That difference matters. One enemy is framed as ideological, the other is framed as racial and communal. The state doesn't just punish actions, it punishes identity and leadership traditions. Wait, notice what a spectacle does after the rope is cut. It creates a map inside the living. It teaches routes to safety that feel shameful. Survivors begin to deny their indigeneity in public because visibility becomes a liability. Traditional dress is hidden. Nawat is pushed into the home, spoken softly, and sometimes not taught to children at all. People learn new instincts, change your accent, flatten your story, blend. This is not forgetting. This is survival training under threat of annihilation. And it changes social life. Civilian patrols and the civic guard's collaboration with local power create a culture of accusation. Old feuds find new uniforms. Personal vengeance becomes security. Trust dissolves. Institutions that once held community, church influence, cofradías, and local authorities lose credibility as fear contaminates the gathering itself. Because once the state weaponizes the crowd becomes afraid of its own mouth. Hold that. Silence isn't only imposed from above, it is also enforced side by side, neighbor to neighbor. For the coffee elite, La Matanza teaches a false lesson that feels like truth. Solidarity among the powerful matters more than reconciliation with the nation. Concession is framed as death. For the military, the massacre confirms its claim to rule. Only the uniform can save the country. And Martinez follows the massacre with years of dictatorship, hardening an authoritarian model that will echo through the century. Even elites who thought they controlled the uniform learn that the uniform has its own appetite. Now shift the lens to another erasure that moves in the shadow of the better known one, blackness in El Salvador. Afro-descended people have been present in Central America since the colonial period, through conquest caravans, enslaved labor, domestic service, mining, and market life. The records are thin and mestizage blurred categories, but absence in textbooks is not absence in reality. After 1932, the state's racial imagination tightens and the law begins to signal who belongs to the nation's future. In 1933, a migration law restricted or prohibited the entry of several groups, including those categorized as the black race. This isn't primarily a mass expulsion campaign of black Salvadorans already living there. It's something more insidious, a whitening gate, a legal closure that helps define blackness as foreign. Wait, notice how the law works like an atmosphere. It teaches the street what to assume. It builds the reflex that when someone is black, they must be from somewhere else, never from here. At the same time, the state performs a double move with indigeneity. It can tolerate an indigenous past as folklore, colorful, harmless, safely distant. It can print the image on postcards and murals, but it cannot tolerate indigenous people as living political actors with land-based demands. That's the theft at the center. The state steals aesthetics and kills agency. It takes the embroidery and burns the voice. It celebrates an indigenous heritage while making indigenous survival a private, risky act. So after La Matanza, three national stories compete: communist insurrection, campesino revolt, and indigenous rebellion. Each contains truth. Each can be used as a cage. The state prefers the story that makes it look like a guardian against chaos. But the land keeps another record. The massacre functioned like colonial terror, updating an old asymmetry, elite power and security forces against indigenous bodies under the banner of modern governance. The uniforms changed. The logic did not. If you listen closely, you also hear older echoes. A century earlier, Anastasio Aquino led an indigenous uprising and was captured and executed. Stories circulate of his head displayed as an example, a warning made physical. Whether every detail is preserved perfectly, the pattern is unmistakable, the state teaches with bodies. Wait, notice what repetition does. It shapes a people's political imagination. It teaches that resistance is not only dangerous, but also punishable in ways designed to haunt your grandchildren. That haunting becomes a political inheritance. For decades, the armed forces have resisted making room for civilian participation when it threatens their dominance. When open force becomes inconvenient, violence adapts, collusion, clandestine operations, and later the logic of death squads, and ordinary people learn that politics is a cliff. By the late 20th century, the poor are pressured into polar choices: align with the anti-communist crusade of elites and the military, or align with insurgents claiming a revolutionary future. Either direction can lead to death. Hold this, because it's the darkest legacy. La Matanza plants the fear that it can happen again, not as paranoia, as historical memory. Even after the 1992 peace accords opened a door toward national reconciliation, paper doesn't instantly rewire nervous systems. Fear lives in the body. Silence becomes a family recipe. Don't talk too loud. Don't get involved. Don't let them know. People inherit caution the way they inherit eye color. The state trained it. The crowd reinforced it. Now return to the plaza, our bull ring without bulls. The gate returns. Again and again. The gate of the finca decides who eats. The gate of the barracks decides who lives. The gate of the town square that turns a community into an audience. The gate inside the mouth that determines what can be said. and every gate bears the same lesson. Visibility has a cost. Wait, notice how quickly a society can learn that lesson when the tuition is paid in bodies. And remember the mechanism that makes this story more terrifying than any lone villain. They weaponized the crowd. It wasn't only the army as an abstract institution. It was security forces, the National Guard, the Civic Guard, and armed units moving alongside civilian patrols and local power networks. It was a denunciation turned into policy. A neighbor is pointing to save himself. A rival settling a score under the flag of order. That's why the silence lasted so long. It wasn't only fear of the state, there was fear of each other. So when details disagree, ceiba or olive, exact routes, exact counts, don't treat that as weakness. Treat it as a fingerprint of trauma and repression. Terror disrupts archives. It forces memory underground. It turns truth into a whisper passed from mouth to mouth, careful, edited, protective. The essential facts remain steady. January 22nd, 1932, uprising in the West. Security forces and allied patrols respond with mass violence. Leaders like Ama are executed as spectacle. Tens of thousands die. Survivors reshape identity to survive. And still, the story contains a stubborn ember. Because memory doesn't only live in paper. It lives in rituals kept small, in words saved like seeds, in cofradías that adapt, in families that change their clothing outside but keep their stories inside. Survival becomes water under a stone, quiet, persistent, difficult to capture. That's not romantic. That's what people do when the alternative is erasure. Wait, notice how strength can look like silence, when silence is the only safe language left. One last warning, spoken gently because it matters. The easiest way to disrespect a people is to erase their intelligence by turning their history into a conspiracy cartoon. Yes, international politics mattered. Yes, anti-communism was an influential label. But reducing La Matanza to a single outside plot steals agency from the campesinos and indigenous communities who knew precisely what land loss and hunger meant. It also hides local responsibility, the elites, the patrols, and the everyday racism that made mass violence possible. So we end where we began, the plaza as a bullring, the gate as a lesson, the crowd as a weapon. A crackdown becomes a massacre, and then the country learns to whisper. Not because it forgot, because it remembered too well. And now I want to ask you softly the way survivors had to ask, what silences were trained into your family? What topic was never spoken of at the table? What identity was covered for safety? Tell me, what other gates do you think were built inside us? And who taught us to keep them closed? Muchas gracias. Thanks for trekking the hidden trails of Latin America with me. If tonight's story unsettled you, subscribe and ring the bell, because Latin America's most intriguing stories are far from over.